The plants that are all around us are sometimes hidden in kind of unusual ways that we might not think about. What we want to examine in this episode is some of the plants that are involved in the production of alcoholic beverages. And so these are plants that many people consume pretty regularly and don't even think about the fact that they're consuming plants. Even more than this, we want to think about the fact that these are plants that have played important roles throughout history and have really shaped the face of the earth as we see it today, both politically and culturally and socially and economically. Let's go into Murphy's Bar and take a look at some of the beverages that have really changed the world as we know it today, and talk about some of the plants that are used in the production of these. So much of human history has taken place in a bar such as this, where people come in, they have a good time, they talk, they work out plans, they plan revolutions, they change the world. And so that's some of the things we want to talk about as we're thinking about alcoholic beverages and their role in the world and in history and in our modern lives. The basis of just about all alcoholic beverages is the fermentation of starches that are found in plants. And it can be any part of a plant. Different kinds of plants store their starches in different parts. So it could be roots, it could be stems, it could be leaves, it could be the fruit or the seeds. So where we find alcoholic beverages really varies around the world, and we find some really ingenious ways that people have figured out how to ferment beverages. We don't really know how old fermentation is. The oldest records of human history actually record alcoholic beverages. Some people have argued that the earliest forms of writing were partially involved in keeping track of the commercial sale of beers and wines and related grain products. It's really hard to say how far back it goes. It's possible that our most distant ancestors, hundreds of thousands of years ago, actually consumed fermented products that they made from fruits around them. Every culture around the world practices some form of fermentation, and this is really important. We could say that fermentation is something that is uniquely human. We don't really know of other animals on Earth that regularly practice fermentation, although there's quite a few that take advantage of it when it happens to just happen around them. In addition to the fact that every human culture practices some form of fermentation, its uses are pretty varied. So in some cultures, the purpose of fermentation is to produce ceremonial beverages that are used in different kinds of rituals and are not necessarily consumed on a daily basis. In other cases, fermentation is used to augment the diet, either to increase diversity of foods that are eaten or to change the nutritional quality. This is particularly true in the tropics, where fermentation can be used to increase the vitamin content of a number of different common foods that are eaten. Fermentation does not always involve the production of alcohol or ethanol. And so we have many fermented foods and drinks that are non-alcoholic, and this is really important. Some people seem to confuse the notion of fermentation with alcohol production. However, today we want that confusion because we're focused on alcoholic beverages. In order to have fermentation, you really need two things. You need some kind of starch, and this is typically taken out of a grain or a fruit or some other part of a plant. And you need to have a yeast, or in some cases a bacteria, that can digest that starch and as a waste product produce alcohol. Probably amongst the oldest of alcoholic beverages are the beers. These are recorded in the earliest records from the Middle East, where we have the oldest human written languages. And then they also pop up in other languages, such as in Asia, as early as these languages are developed. So beers are pretty simply made. and a lot of the older traditional beers, probably most of us today wouldn't want to drink. The original beers involved grain where some of the grain was slightly sprouted, and this grain would then form a malt. That malt releases enzymes that start to digest the sugars. If you were to taste slightly sprouted grain, you'd taste that it tastes a little bit sweet. And people probably figured this out early on, that this was kind of a good flavor. If you then mix that malted grain with some other grain, it will start to digest the rest of the grain. It turns out that people rapidly learned that if you then heat that up, eventually some other enzymes start to break down the sugars even further, and you produce lots of sugars. If you then let that cool and sit, yeasts that are in the air will fall into it, or bacteria that's contaminated from human hands will get into it and will start to cause the fermentation process. After it sits for a few days of brewing, and it'll be all kind of foamy and everything, people would come along and poke a straw down into it and drink the liquid that's below all the foam on the surface. And this is probably what the earliest beers consisted of. We have evidence from ancient Egypt of people fermenting bread, and in fact there's still some so-called bread beers that are made. What happens in this is the grains are baked into an unleavened bread, and then this is dried out, and then this hard, crumbly bread is broken up and put into water or into a mush that already has some grain ground into it, and this whole product is allowed to ferment. The process of making the bread actually releases more of the sugars and makes it more digestible for both the microorganisms, the yeasts or the bacteria, and for the humans that later want to drink the beverage. Bread beers are still available in places like Egypt and Ethiopia and other parts of the Middle East. They're kind of hard to find in the United States and other parts of the world. The yeasts that are used in production of beers and wines are highly specialized today. However, this wasn't the case in the past. In the past, people were somewhat reliant upon whatever kinds of microorganisms happened to fall into their vats while they were making things. Over time, people learned that if you reused a vat that made a particularly good batch, that you got consistency. You got a batch of fermented beverage that was consistently good. And what was really happening was that the microorganisms were becoming trapped in the cracks or crevices of whatever the container was, say a wooden bowl or a leather bag or whatever, and that these were then recontaminating each subsequent batch. And if you had a bacteria or a yeast that made a pleasant flavor in your beer, you consistently got that. And so people developed these kind of traditions of saving either a little bit of the brew from a prior batch or reusing the container in which it was made. And so we have some very famous products around the world that are made from these batch processes. One of the more unusual hypotheses about the origins of beers comes from the observation that the kinds of microorganisms that commonly cause infections in humans, this can be athlete's foot, it can be yeast infections, it can be ringworm infections, that these same kinds of organisms are able to ferment starches. And so one hypothesis is that people who had one of these kinds of infections were preparing grain. Somehow the grain got wet and sat out for a while. Maybe it started to look like it was spoiled. People kind of left it to one side. But maybe they became particularly hungry and wanted to consume it. So since this was all that they had, they went ahead and consumed it and found, hey, wow, there's something new going on here. And they tried to reproduce the process. And so it's kind of a grody thing to think about, but many of the things that consist as pathogens in humans actually are good fermentation microorganisms, and therefore are likely related to the organisms that we now consider so fondly to produce world-famous beers. As people developed agriculture and they started to store grains, it became really important that they store grains in a way that kept them fresh. And of course, this wasn't always perfect. And so we know that sometimes grains accidentally became moist or became damaged in some other way, infected with some kind of a fungus such as ergot. And of course, people were trying to avoid this, so they learned to bake it as bread. And sometimes you could store bread better than you could store the actual grain. One of the ways of storing grains is to convert them into an alcoholic beverage and then store the beverage instead of the actual grain. This also allows for people to consume different volumes. It turns out that people can consume a set volume of grain as their food, or they can consume the same set volume of grain as a fermented beverage. And there's actually more nutritional quality coming out of the fermented beverage than out of the grain that's either eaten as a porridge or a gruel or converted into bread. And so there are actually some nutritional advantages of consuming alcoholic beverages made of grains. In addition to producing malted beverages from grain that's been pre-sprouted, grain can also be cooked and then fermented without the process of malting. And this produces different flavors and aromas to the final product. In addition, we can then take the products of fermentation and distill them. And so a little later on here, I'm going to discuss the process of distillation. But it's important to realize that all of these distilled products first have to go through the process of fermentation. And so the fermented products and the distilled products are tightly linked together, and they actually form kind of families of beverages. So before I go any further with the alcoholic beverages, I just want to mention a few of the non-alcoholic food products that are made through the process of fermentation, just to keep you thinking about the fact that there's a lot more going on here. And one thing that I want you to think about is that some of these products that are eaten as fermented non-alcoholic products are actually related to fermented alcoholic products. So some of these include things such as bread, kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, ma, soy sauce, and quite a few other products. There's also some non-alcoholic beverages that involve the process of fermentation. This includes chocolate or cocoa, coffee, black tea, and quite a few others. And so when you're drinking one of these, think about the fact that it's fermented, but it doesn't have alcohol in it. And so you see this process of fermentation is actually much more important than you might think. The process of microorganisms partially digesting something that we then eat. In kind of an odd way when you think about it, when a microorganism digests a food and then we eat it, we're basically eating the waste product of a microorganism. Don't think too long on that, though. If we consider the biogeography of alcoholic beverages, not only do we find them made all around the world, but we also find the distribution of what they are and how they're made and stored a little bit different. So if we look in colder climates, in the temperate zone, we find that people tend to make beers, and they tend to store these beers in some kind of container. And so in these climates, we find that people produce grain throughout the summer months, they harvest it in the fall, and then store that throughout the winter and the subsequent year. They also convert it in the winter and other months into various forms of beers. In the most cold climates, we don't usually find the production of wines, although this is, of course, changing in the modern era where people have access to grapes from slightly warmer climates. As we move closer to the equator, we find cultures that have a mixture of beers and wines and are producing these more or less throughout the year. This is because they have the products, the grains and the fruits, more often available all year round. And in fact, when we're in the true tropics, we find that people most commonly produce fresh beer or fresh wines or other fermented products and consume them within just a matter of days to weeks of their production, and that there's not really any formal storage process. And so this is kind of an important issue. It's the people in the temperate climates that really develop the process of production and storage of beverages. People in the tropics really develop the greatest diversity of fermented products. And it's largely because they really had more things to kind of play around with and a lot more time each year to experiment and try to make beverages. And so if you're interested kind of looking at the diversity of plants that's used in making alcoholic beverages, it's best to look in the tropics. If you're interested in looking at the commercial side of it, the ones that have really developed into the major world products, it's in the temperate zone that you want to look, because that's where most of this development has occurred. Even when we have products that have become commercialized in the tropics, it turns out these are products that were developed by people from temperate zones, particularly temperate Europe, who went to the tropics and applied the technologies of the temperate zone to tropical crops and tropical fermented beverages, and then have distributed these around the world. So in temperate climates, particularly the colder temperate climates, we find that people make beers. they then can distill these and make things such as whiskeys. And in fact, if these are distilled even further, you can make clear grain alcohols. In more warmer climates, we find that people are more likely to make different kinds of fruit wines. If you take a fruit wine and distill it, you basically make something like a brandy. And brandy is actually an interesting word if we stop and think about it. Brandy, the root word of this, comes from the idea of a burnt wine. And the English word brandy, or a French word brandy, actually originally comes from the idea of burnt wine, where a wine was distilled and made into a concentrate, and this was brandy. If you then process those brandies, either adding flavorings or otherwise changing them, you can make a wide range of liqueurs that are consumed. In the tropical climates, we also have this wide range of other products that are made that include fruit wines, or sometimes these are called beers. These can be distilled into different kinds of rums. We have stem toddies, such as sugarcane, that's made into rum. And we have the classic root beers that are made into products such as vodka. Now, of course, most people today think of vodka from the extreme cold climates of Russia, where potatoes are used to make it, but it turns out that's a relatively modern product. Wines are produced from quite a number of species of grapes, at least the most common wines that we think of. However, it turns out that wines can be made from just about any kind of fruit around the world, and by fruit I'm really limiting this to kind of juicy fruits. For botanists, any kind of a reproductive structure is a fruit, so we're just thinking of juicy fruits. But the most common wines are made from grapes or vitis, and a lot of our words in our vocabulary of talking about wines comes from the early production of these, particularly around the Mediterranean region. So our words are from Latin. And when we say wine, we're actually using a word that refers to the original grapes, the vitis, the source of life, the drink of life. The process of making wines involves several different possible steps. Some of the most simple wines are made from just allowing fruits to sit out and ferment and the liquid to collect from them. Sometimes this liquid is strained off, or in other times the whole fruit is kind of mixed together and the fermented kind of mush that results is consumed as a wine. These are fairly nutritious wines, but they're not really kind of the classic wines that we might think of today. The classic wines of today are made by first collecting the fruit when it's properly ripened and the sugars are at the right stage for production of a particular wine, and then crushing these fruits and then expressing or separating the juice from the fruit itself. In some cases, bits of the fruit, either the seeds or the skins of the grapes, are left with the juice as the fermentation process proceeds, and this changes the color or aroma of the particular wine that's made. Wines are then taken through the process of fermentation, where the microorganisms, the yeasts, are allowed to ferment them and convert the sugars into alcohol. And of course, not all of the sugars are converted into alcohol. It turns out that what happens is that the yeast will digest the sugars up to a point where that yeast can no longer live within the alcohol environment, and the alcohol basically kills the yeast that made it, or the bacteria that made it. At that point, the bacteria or yeast die, and you're left with a certain concentration of alcohol. And so different kinds of wines can sometimes be up to 13 to maybe 15% alcohol, and that's about the highest concentration you can get from the microorganisms. Any level above that and the microorganisms die. Now, in the distant past, alcohols were probably not nearly as strong, and so if you had a wine, it was more likely to be 5 to 6%. This is more of the level of alcohol production of the wild types of yeasts. The more modern types have been selected for their ability to survive higher alcohol concentration environments. But of course, that's a very modern phenomenon. So ancient wines were not nearly as strong as modern wines can be at times. So once we've gone through the process of fermentation, there's a settling that occurs. And so you have residues that are found distributed within the liquid of the wine, and these are allowed to settle, and then they're tapped off and taken out. Really famous wineries are able to have, or famous wineries have staffs that come in and are able to rapidly remove all of the residues that dissolve out of their wine, and so you get a wine in the end that's kind of a nice, clear, even product. But once again, this is a very modern thing. Even just a few hundred years ago, wines had a residue at the bottom of the container, or they were filled with little chunks of old fruit and other things floating around in them. And so drinking a wine involved a little bit of the process of filtering out some of the contaminants that were there. Finally, with wines, we oftentimes have an aging process. And the aging can either occur within a barrel, this is the most common way, or it can occur within another kind of container. And what happens in this process is that some of the alcohol is lost, but we also adopt flavorings from the container itself. And there can be some subsequent secondary fermentation that occurs. So in the case of a barrel, we oftentimes have something like an oak barrel, and some of the tannins and other flavorings that are found in the wood of the oak enter into the alcohol and change the flavor of the wine that's produced, and then is subsequently bottled. Once wine is in a bottle, it also continues to change in flavor, and different wines have kind of different age spectrums. As it turns out, really old wines, in fact a few that have been found that are thousands of years old, are not necessarily that good. Wine has a period in which it's considered to be of optimal flavor. So a wine that's a little too young probably doesn't have the right taste. A wine that's a little too old has probably lost some of its good taste. So the process of making beer is somewhat similar to the process of making wine. However, it turns out that to make most beers is actually far more complicated than the production of wine. And so the ability for the average person to go out and make a wine that's drinkable is a lot easier than the ability of the average person to go out and make a beer that's really drinkable. Because there's a lot of subtle nuances that differentiate or that distinguish between a good beer and a bad beer. So the process of making beer first involves malting of some grain, and this is basically the sprouting of grain. Most commonly, the grains that are used is barley. However, there are also wheat beers that are made, and beers made from other kinds of grains. In tropical Americas, we have beers that are made from corn and go under a wide variety of indigenous names. The second step in the production of beer is the flavoring step. This could involve the addition of hops or other kinds of herbs. There's lots of different secret recipes that involve all kinds of different ingredients. Some of these ingredients in the past were considered to be magical or aphrodisiacs or all kinds of other things. And it turns out most of these other ingredients are plants. Some of the classic examples are the inclusion of plants such as wormwood to make unusual beers that will protect you from evil spirits. There may be a variety of adjuncts that are added. This could include the addition of starch or just simply adding sugar to the beer that provides more material on which the fermentation process can occur. It lightly sweetens the beer but also increases the alcohol content in the long run. Next, we go through the process of mashing, which is the simplification of the sugars. This is where the enzymes that are involved that have been introduced from the malt start to break down the more complex carbohydrates into simpler sugars and make them more digestible and convert it into alcohol. Once this process has gone through its steps and the enzymes have kind of digested the sugars, then the material will be brought to a boil. And in the boiling, the sugars are further broken down and made even more simple and available for fermentation. Then we reach the important step of brewing. And in brewing is when we actually have the fermentation process occur. A lot of times this is done in closed containers so that one of the byproducts of fermentation, which is carbon dioxide, can be captured. Now, of course, in many modern beers, carbon dioxide is actually added as a separate pressurized product, but in a lot of traditional beers, the carbon dioxide that's produced is the byproduct of the fermentation process, where you take sugars such as glucose or fructose and convert these into alcohol with the secondary product of carbon dioxide being given off. Once we've gone through the fermentation process, this is usually the final stage for many beers. However, there are a few where there are some additional steps, where either there's secondary fermentation that occurs, there may be extra grain alcohol that's added, or these could be frozen and then the ice removed as a way of concentrating the volume of alcohol that's present. Lots of different kinds of beers are being made. There's probably on the order of tens of thousands of beers made around the world, and they all have one claim to fame or another. However, sitting in front of us is probably the world's most famous beer, Guinness. And of course, the big claim to fame that scientists will point to Guinness is that the whole field of modern statistics developed out of the Guinness breweries in England and Ireland, and their desire to have a consistent quality product. And so if you've learned to use statistics and love it, you can blame it on beer. If you've learned to hate statistics, you can also blame that on beer. After we've produced beer, a development that was made probably first in the regions of Arabia, or possibly even going back to ancient Greece, is the process of distillation. And in the process of distillation, what we do is we take a product such as beer or wine or any other fermented beverage, and we heat it up and concentrate the alcohol that's in it by causing a steam to occur, and the alcohol has a lower boiling point than water, and so the alcohol will boil off first and will be collected and will concentrate. This also leaves behind quite a lot of the contaminants and impurities that may be found in a simple fermented beverage, and gives us a very clear beverage in the end. It may not be clear in color, but it will definitely be clear of residues, because those are left behind in the boiling vat. So if we consider beer, beer is commonly made and then distilled into whiskeys. Now, of course, very few people drink the beer that's made into whiskeys, because these beers have been highly selected and altered so that they don't necessarily produce a good tasting beer, but they do produce an excellent whiskey at the end of the day. So once you've made your beer, you go through the process of distillation and produce a clear liquor. This alcohol, this liquor, is then placed in wooden barrels, usually made of oak, and these barrels are allowed to sit for a period of time. During that period of time, the whiskey will be forming as it is absorbing the flavors of the barrel and is aging with time. Given enough time, the alcohol also starts to slowly leak out through the barrel, and we actually have the alcohol concentration decrease, but the flavor increases as the contents of the liquid absorb the flavorings of the barrel. Next to me are some examples of single malts, and these are whiskeys that are produced from a single process where a beer is made into an alcohol and then is stored in barrels using a very specific traditional recipe. The barrels oftentimes are made consistently from the same place, maybe from the same forest, or they may be recycled barrels that are coming from either bourbon barrels or port barrels. And these barrels may be fired on the inside to produce a kind of a burnt flavor in the whiskey. Lots of different tricks that people do to give the whiskeys different flavors. And once they're made, these single malts will have very distinctive flavors. Now, for many people, this is the preferred form of whiskey, which is whiskeys that have a relatively strong flavor that are very distinguishable. What's interesting with the single malts is that from batch to batch, each batch of a particular single malt will taste a little bit different than the prior batch. They're close to the same, but they're not exactly the same. And for many single malt drinkers, this becomes a really critical element where they can even, their palate becomes so well developed that they can tell you the particular age of a whiskey, where it was made, and how long it sat in a cask before it was bottled. Now, one of the things to think about is that people will buy whiskeys that may be 10 years old or 30 years old or 40 years old, and then they'll try and sit on that bottle and say, well, now my 10-year-old whiskey is 20-year-old whiskey after 10 years. But that's not the case. The age of the whiskey is really the amount of time it's spent in the cask. As soon as it goes into the bottle, it's done aging. It doesn't age anymore in the bottle. So a 20-year-old bottle of whiskey that spent 10 years of its life in a cask and 10 years on the shelf in your home is still only a 10-year-old bottle of whiskey. So next we want to take a look at the blended whiskeys, and these involve a subtle change. So consumers tend to like to have a consistent product, and recognizing this fact, a couple hundred years ago, different distillers of whiskey started blending whiskeys to produce a product that had a consistently uniform flavor. And so they made blended whiskeys such as this one that the consumer could buy and have a taste that they could predict, a taste that they would know, every time they go and buy a bottle of it, it's going to taste the same. Whereas with the single malts, we don't always have exactly the same taste. And some of this is because of subtle variations in the materials that are used. So for instance, if we have a whiskey that is made in a wooden cask, an oak cask, and then after a while it's taken out of that cask and put into a secondary cask to add another flavor, and then maybe even put into a third cask to add yet another flavor, the process will not be exactly the same from time to time, and so we'll get differences in the flavoring. For single malt lovers, this is the greatness of it. They really love that difference. But for people who want a consistently uniform product, which is actually most people, they prefer something like the blends. During the European colonial era, at least at the beginning of the European colonial era, sailors would leave the old world with containers on their ship of either beer or wine, and they would consume this as they traveled around the world. And this was partly there as a food and partly there as a way to make the sailors happier. However, when the sailors would arrive in some exotic port, one of the first things they would try to do is find a way to get more alcohol, because on ship this was being rationed to them. And they weren't really given enough at any one time to get drunk while they're on the ship. This obviously isn't something that the ship's captain would try to promote. However, once they're in port, the sailors wanted to cut loose. Well, it turns out in many places that they went, the sailors found that the local people either weren't producing very much alcohol, or they didn't realize that they could produce it in high quantities or in high concentrations. And so these sailors developed the habit of passing around the skills of both fermentation and production of beers and wines, and of production of distillation. And it's in the act of distillation that they really kind of developed some of their most interesting products. In one case, if we look in the Caribbean, we can see that the early sailors traveling across the Atlantic between Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean were bringing in beer and wine. Over time, they started moving whiskey and brandy and other kinds of concentrated alcohols, because they could actually put more bang for their buck into their ship. So if you transport a big cask of brandy versus a cask the same size of wine, you don't move nearly as much alcohol with the wine as you do with the brandy. And of course their goal was to move lots of alcohol. And this is particularly important when you're wanting to trade with people who want this alcohol as the end product. Maybe you're trading for slaves or other kinds of goods. Over time, the various European colonies had to develop products that they could also export. And of course, having a really high quality distilled beverage was of value to most of the colonies. Well, since a lot of these colonies were in tropical countries, they couldn't really grow the grains to make things such as whiskey, and they weren't necessarily the right kinds of environments to raise grapes to make wine in order to make things like brandy. So what they did was they started converting the starches of whatever they had on hand to make beers, and then they distilled these. And one of the most important of these was the production of rum from secondary products of sugar production. A byproduct of the production of sugar is molasses, and in many cases this was just kind of a waste product that was thrown away. However, in the Caribbean, they learned that you could take molasses and that this could be fermented further and then distilled and made into a product called rum bouillon. And rum bouillon was a really vile drink, and it was considered to be, the lowest of the low-grade things. However, as the name changed over time from rum bouillon into rum, it became a little bit more socially acceptable, although it still has a persona of being kind of on the wild side, maybe the drink of pirates, you might say. Rum then became an export of many tropical colonies, where they were producing sugar. They would export the sugar, and they would also export the rum as a value-added byproduct. And so we see the development of products like this. The same thing happens in many other countries where we have the development of tequila as a distilled version of agave, where the agave beer was not terribly exportable, but suddenly the ability to export the distillate of it is highly exportable. And we see this happening in a number of places around the world. Even in Hawaii, we had the production of a beer from a local plant, and then its conversion through distillation into a concentrated alcohol beverage. And this product is okole hau. The history of this is a little bit vague. There are some records of it, particularly in Vancouver's arrival when he came and visited Maui. He records his sailors going ashore and producing okole hau from a beer that they made. What's uncertain is if Hawaiians were making a beer prior to this. Okole hau is made from tea, or Cordyline fruticosa roots, and these roots are collected. They're very starchy, and the roots actually can be eaten raw. You can't eat too much of them, but you can eat them raw, and they taste kind of like eating a raw potato. If you take the roots and ferment them, you can produce a kind of a root beer. Now, there's a possibility that ancient Hawaiians actually were making this kind of root beer. We do know that Hawaiians were regularly collecting tea roots, and in fact this is probably the main reason that tea was brought to Hawaii and brought to many other parts of the Pacific, was as a food source. These starchy roots would be collected, they would be baked in an imu or an imu ki, such as the town in the edge of Honolulu called Kaimu ki, often mispronounced as Kaimu ki. And in this imu, the starch would be converted into simpler sugars where it was much more edible. And then people would eat the tea roots. However, if you let those roots sit out for a little while, they start to ferment naturally. And there's quite a few old Hawaiian recipes for taking tea roots, or actually also sweet potato tubers, and putting these into a bowl and allowing them to ferment for a while, and then consuming that root beer product that comes from that. Now, the sailors that arrived early on in the colonial era saw these starchy products. They may have seen this beer, or they may have made it themselves. They then took the beer, they set up stills and distilled it and collected the liquor that came from it, and this liquor is what's known as okole hau. Now, over time, particularly in the 1800s, people started taking the liquor and putting it into wooden barrels and aging it, much as you would age any kind of a whiskey. And in fact, a fine okole hau has the same taste as a really good quality Scotch whiskey. And so if you ever get a chance to try some okole hau in the Hawaiian Islands, I highly recommend trying it. I'd like to really thank all of our ancestors who produced all of these great beverages that they've passed down to us. And you know, the next time you happen to drink a nice frosty one, think about all the plants that are involved and all of the world history that's involved in these beverages.